Marcia was sorry she had wandered so far in this skull-drilling heat, in a place she didn't know, which, for all its bleakness, didn't look known by any. The small houses were silvered from the salt air, warped and bloodless, rows of bleached skulls on display. She had wandered beyond the coffee shops and gift stores, tacky or trendy, the miniature art galleries and the expensive little restaurants that crowded the more tourist-favoured streets of this seaside town. Marcia didn't hold those bustling, colourful streets in disfavour, but this afternoon she had felt the need to be alone. Well, the need to escape the anonymous crowds, at any rate. She was travelling alone, to begin with. She took on these missionary-like missions to far-flung allied companies eagerly, welcomed the time away from her tiny office, her bosses, her co-workers. She normally stayed in a hotel in the course of these excursions, but a co-worker had a summer cottage here, a mere half-hour's ride from the host company. It was quaint, humble, not actually within view of the ocean, but that was fine with Marcia, who had never been the volleyball type. She had been reluctant to accept, not wanting to feel obligated to friendship or worse with this male co-worker, but she had decided it might be nice to have a cute little cottage all to herself. Today her work was over. Tomorrow she flew back home. This time was her own, and her own time was of the greatest importance. So she had set out on foot, in sneakers and blue jeans and a crisp new t-shirt, short red hair and big dark glasses, free of her sharp-edged dark suits and ant-black shoes. She had forsaken her rental car, stopped at a coffee shop along the way to buy a large iced coffee to take with her on an aimless walk. She had turned into one less peopled street, then into another less peopled than that, and on, till there were no shops, just houses, closing in on narrow streets more like alleys. From a tiny, cage-like screened porch, an old woman who looked headless with her upper body lost in shadow waved at Marcia dreamily. Marcia gave a little wave back. A dog, unseen, had growled at her from beneath another porch, she assumed, or perhaps behind a screened window, as she passed by. But in this street there were no old ladies, no dogs, no strewn, bright and broken toys. The houses looked derelict, abandoned. The windows and doors of several were even boarded up. As Marcia started down this street, sweating now and wondering if she should turn back, her coffee was gone, but she carried the cup with her, not wanting to litter. She took note of an old faded barber pole outside one of the boarded-up structures, and then her gaze travelled from this point to the window of another establishment, next door. This one wasn't boarded up. A large shop window, dusty but unbroken, faced out into the arid street. What did its sign say? Was it a laundry? A few more half-hearted steps through the broiling air and Marcia could read it. All washed up. She smiled faintly. That was for sure. Was it a joke? A comment on the state of this little sub-neighbourhood? She drew closer to the glass which blazed back the molten sun. On display inside the shop window were tables and chairs and angled boxes spread with mostly seashells, along with decorative bits of driftwood and a blistered buoy or two. Seashells. Marcia had been taught an enthusiasm for them by her mother, who had a fine museum-quality collection. It was something that they had in common, something they had been able to talk about. They had never talked about much. "She's cold, your mother," Brian had said. "She's British, it's her reserve," Marcia had told him. "Even British people can be passionate," he had countered. "Or there wouldn't be any more Brits brought into the world, if you catch my meaning." "He meant it about me more than my mother," Marcia reminded herself now. "He thought I was cold. He told me so." "I never know what you're feeling. Do you even love me? You never even smile, Marcia." The guilt trip. The accusations. She had left it behind now. And he had cried. Tears and all. "You're like your mother. You know that." But they talked about seashells, she and her mother, from when Marcia was a child. Her mother didn't stroke her hair, didn't giggle and nudge her. But Marcia liked to believe that the dry, formal genus and species names they both uttered were like an encrypted language of affection, the touching of bony surfaces, crusted rough or smooth as mother of pearl, were like caresses traded. She liked to believe. Marcia craned her neck from side to side, attempting to look further into the shop, but it was charcoal gloom. The displays were filmed in dust. Could this place still be in business? If it was indeed open, could enough tourists stray far enough to make this business anything more than a hobby, like selling one's own preserves at a fair? Marcia moved to the door and tested its latch. It was unlocked. The door squealed open. No bells jingled. She stood a moment in an early evening beam of slanting and gilded light that swarmed with motes like churning plankton. There was a table in the corner with a chair behind it, a few books stacked there, and a lamp that was unlit. Marcia looked there first, to see if someone would be waiting for that rare, lost customer. But the impromptu desk was empty. She eased the door shut guiltily behind her, wondering if she were trespassing. She saw no sign in the door announcing business hours. How could this shop not be defunct? Only the fact that the door had been unlocked, that, and the tempting array of shells, encouraged her to move deeper into the shadowy room. There were tables in its centre, and shelves and benches around its sides. There was a bookshelf with various titles on shells and the sea, and Martha recognized a few that her mother and even herself owned. But the shells drew her foremost. She might find a few things here for her own long-neglected collection. More importantly, she might even find a few things here that her mother didn't own, that she could mail to her back home. They had lived half a country apart for 6 years now. Mailing a shell would be better than their brief telephone exchanges. Marcia neared the closest of the centre tables. There were shallow cardboard boxes with shells ranked inside them, the names of the shells either written on the cards, or on the floors of the boxes themselves, or on stickers stuck to the shells. The prices looked very good, even too good. Again, Martha had the impression that the shop was defunct. Either that, or lost in a pocket of time long past. The names of shells had always delighted her, and she relieved that old nostalgic pleasure now. She lifted a lovely imperial harp into her palm, then set it delicately down again. There was one called an Eye of Judas. There was an abalone used as a bowl, and filled with numerous little spotted shells called measled cowries. She wondered, not for the first time, if the huge queen conch with its smooth vivid pink lips had been so named for its lewd resemblance to a female's genitalia. Even considering it made Martha embarrassed. Brian would have made a joke if she had suggested such a thing. Perhaps held the shell up to his mouth and flicked his tongue in it. And she would have chided him, or just ignored him, and he might have laughed or sulked and told her she had no sense of humour. From atop an old bureau, she lifted a greenish, violet spider conch in its own box, pillowed with cotton pads. There was an arthritic spider conch, which looked like a dangerous creature that had become fossilized. The diseased-sounding, postulated triton. The appropriately leering, grinning ton. A loud thump, the rattle of glass, and Marcia was startled, dropping the shell she was presently holding, heard it clatter at her feet. Peripherally, she had seen something strike the glass in the shop's closed door. At first she had thought it was a thrown toy, but in the tail of her eye she had seen the dark blur whiz back up out of sight. A bird, then, chasing insects and colliding with the glass. Good thing it hadn't broken through. It had to be stunned pretty nicely, and now Marcia looked back at the improvised desk in the corner, then at a closed door which must lead further into the house. The loud sound had brought no one to the door, and though she had half expected to see some old woman, who perhaps looked like her aging mother now seated in the chair, there was no one. Still a bit unnerved, Marcia stooped to retrieve the shell she had dropped. Thank God it had no brittle horns or such to snap off. As she gathered it into her hand she noticed there were more boxes of shells pushed under the table and hidden by its draped yellowish cloth. Some boxes were stuffed with brittle newspaper, the shells practically heaped amongst that crumpled garble of old printed words, and one box had written on its side in bold black marker the words, "Sad Things." Marcia glanced up furtively, knelt closer, dragged the box out into view. These were not shells, but other sorts of flotsam and jetsam, detritus of the sea. There was a dark blue beer bottle without a label, with a mummified seahorse corked inside it. There was a child's green plastic alphabet block. There was a naked baby doll with both eyes missing, as if the fish had plucked them out, thinking they might be real. Marcia saw a child's glove knitted from dark green wool, and picked it out of the box. There was something inside the glove. Hardness, jointed and articulated inside each finger of the glove. Marcia immediately dropped it in horror, and part of the interior slid out into view. It was not the skeletal hand of a drowned and dismembered child, but a long dead crab, some of its legs inserted into the fingers and thumbs of the glove. In a sort of disgust born of nervousness, Marcia slid the box back under the table. As she did so, another marked message caught her eye. It said, "Blood." She dragged this box out. It had seashells in it. Some she knew by name, some she didn't, but they were all labelled with stickers. And there seemed to be a theme. There were a number of one kind of shell called the bleeding tooth. It was apt. On the lip of the shell there were several lightish bumps that looked like molars set into a vivid red patch like bloody gums. Similarly, there were several specimens of a blood-mouth conch, with its whole interior a bright red, though it wasn't as gruesome an image as the former shell. Another Marcia extricated from the box was a bloodsucker mitre, which wasn't red, and the naming of which she didn't understand. But then there was the entirely red, full-blooded tellin, an elongated clam in 2 smooth halves. Marcia thought it was beautiful. She was sure her mother would too. She selected the nicest specimen of it she could find in the carton, and as she lifted it out she took note of another sort of shell, the only example of it in the container. Marcia picked it out for a closer view. It was much more violently red than the tellin. Though it was elongated, like the tellin, it was only smooth on the inside, as glassy red as nail polish, its outer halves being rough and horny. They flared like the folded wings of a dragon, and Marcia wondered if it might be something in the family of bivalves called the wing oysters. She turned it over in her hands and read the sticker. Blood wings. Well, she'd been close, but the thing was, she'd never heard of such a shell. That was it, then. Without a second look, Marcia set down the tellin and rose with the blood wings. There was no price on the sticker. The tellin had said $2. Marcia decided she would leave 10 on the table in the corner, with a little note. It wasn't a common shell, or she'd be aware of it, and so $10, at least in this store, seemed fair. It wasn't like she was buying the ultra-rare glory of the seas with a 10. It couldn't be too extremely rare to be buried in a box under a table like that. The first pen she chose from the table was dried up, but she got a second to give up enough pale ink for her to scrawl on a scrap of newspaper from the 60s. Then she weighed the note and the $10 bill down with a dried starfish. Marcia lifted her head just as she finished, her eyes fixed on that closed door to the rest of the little structure. Had she heard a sound from somewhere deeper in the house? A distant and muffled but heavy thud. It was the sound she imagined, unaccountably, an old person heavy with soft dead weight might make if they fell out of bed to the floor. Marcia turned to the outer door, and saw that the sun was very low, much lower than she would have thought it would be. Her eyes must have adjusted to the increasing dimness of the shop without her being conscious of it. She had lost track of the time in her absorption. She hurried toward the door, beginning to sweat again though the air was cooling, and was halfway out when she thought she heard the squeal of hinges in the room behind her. But she told herself it was the squeal of the door she was exiting, and thankfully she was out in the empty street again. Not even a car parked along it, as silent as the inside of the shop had been, except for the metallic ringing of the cicadas. As she walked briskly away, she darted a look over her shoulder that flicked her coppery hair. The shop's molten window, now gone obsidian black, and a figure behind the displays, peering out at her from the window, timidly or stealthily. She saw it only as a palish smudge before she turned away sharply. She turned a corner down another, even narrower street, then took a right. It was supposed to be a right, wasn't it? The shell was rough, fanged in her hand. It hurt her flesh, pressing into it. She stopped to slip it into the zippered fanny pack she was wearing, then looked up about her to get a hold on her bearings. Marcia saw the first of the flying things drop down from the bruising sky like a huge, hovering bee. Because of how it flew, for a moment she took it to be a hummingbird. The metallic cicada tone was right in front of her now. Her first instinct was to turn abruptly and walk away from it. Was it a bat? She was afraid it would tangle in her hair, even though she had heard such fears were a myth. She glanced back over her shoulder as she walked briskly. She saw two of the blurred dark flying things now, floating after her through the lingering heat of the air. Marcia quickened her pace, and looking forward again, about to turn down yet another side street, she saw one of the flying animals emerge from it ahead of her. She came to a jarring halt, just as another and another creature appeared from the side street. Martha kept on going straight then, now breaking into a trot, her heart like a fish drowning in air as it laboured in the hot confines of her chest. The cicada buzz mounting, closing in on her, more suffocating than the heat. Another glance back. Now there were more than a dozen of the things, a black swarm, the two groups having converged. They were pursuing her, she knew, drawn to her, and they weren't entirely black, she understood in that instant of looking behind her. There was an indistinct black body, with trailing feathers that she realized were actually more like the short, numerous tentacles of a nautilus. And the wings were not black, but red, violently red. They moved too quickly for her to see them clearly, but she believed the wings were hard and thorny, rough on the outside, smooth as glassy nail polish on the inside. She began to run as fast as she could. The street, unfamiliar now in the rushing gloom, made a T ahead. She started toward the left, but a flock of perhaps a dozen more of the buzzing animals began to pour from its mouth. Stumbling, she caught her balance and redirected herself down the right-hand branch of the T. Marcia's mind was blank with fear, and her lungs were working too hard to spare sound. But she felt a tear drop from the edge of her jaw. She realized she still had the empty coffee cup, half crushed in her hand. She had been too polite to leave it in the shop. She let it drop. She ran. Yet another turn in the bleak maze ahead. She took a chance and lunged into it, and thank God there were none of those creatures. But she heard them behind her. Their buzzsaw sound so loud now it might tear her eardrums, tear her mind. Marcia felt the foremost creature pluck at her white t-shirt with its many black limbs, seeking purchase. She wanted to scream then, cry for help from these many dark staring windows, half blind with grime, their half-drawn shades like senile drooping eyelids. The groping creature caught hold of the material. She felt other squirming features reaching for her now. Her pace was faltering as she forced herself through the lava-like air, her mind a vortex of terror and buzzing, and ahead of her, a familiar landmark at last. A barber pole, unturning. Next door, the seashell shop, its sign all washed up, smiling at her in welcome. She had come full circle, and there were more and more of the flying animals seizing hold of her clothing, and for the first time, her skin. Her steps slowing, crumbling. She had to find shelter, safety. In her mind, she pictured sharp little bird beaks within those nests of writhing arms. Just ahead of her, the door to the shop opened, and a pallid figure filled the doorway. It was an elderly woman, large-bodied, and wearing a white nightgown, and for an instant Marcia thought it was her mother here to protect her. But for all the resemblance, this woman was grinning, and her mother wasn't one to grin. The woman was beckoning to her, and Marcia went to her, staggering, sobbing, the things snarled in her hair and fixing themselves to the flesh of her back, both through and inside the material of her crisp new t-shirt. She could feel blood running down her ribs, the small of her back. But the woman was grinning, and held her fleshy arms out in welcome, and Marcia stumbled into them with a sob of mindless gratitude. Immediately the creatures fell away. The buzzing stopped. She heard the door close with a squeal behind her, and she was folded into the woman's damp and chilly bosom, which smelled of the sea.